Everyone can be their own architectural historian. Here are the tools of the trade. Hello, I'm Kenneth Hafertepe. I'm the Department Chair of Museum Studies at Baylor University, and I'm also an architectural historian. In this presentation, we're going to talk about some of the tools that architectural historians use to make sense of the built environment. These are tools that were used in the recent exhibit at home in Waco at the Mayborn Museum Complex, and they were also tools that were used in my book, Historic Homes of Waco, Texas, on which the exhibit was based. Perhaps the most important advice that I can give you is study the building itself and everything that has happened to it. This is so important, and an important way of knowing your building of a certain genre, a certain era, is to study other buildings that are like it from the same period, comparing how they're similar, how they're different in floor plan, in structure, in detail. It's also very important to study the way that buildings have changed over time. For example, the Earl Harrison House that you see on the left side of the screen had a number of changes happen to it over the years. Perhaps the most important is that it was picked up and moved. It used to be very near what is now I-35 and was moved in the late 1960s to a site on the other side of downtown near to Cameron Park. Other times, historic houses have catastrophic fires, such as the Texas Governor's Mansion. So all of these things are things that need to be taken into account, but all buildings change over time. And so training your eye to see how they have changed is a very important aspect. And the buildings themselves are critical forms of evidence. Another very important source, but oftentimes unavailable for many buildings, are historic images of buildings, historic photos, for example, or woodcuts out of newspapers. We're still here with the Earl Harrison House, one of the oldest houses in Waco. And you see on the left the building on its original location and with members of the family that was occupying it when this photograph was taken, probably the Harrison family. The image on the right is less trustworthy as a document than a photograph is, because the artist can give his own interpretation. But when we set it side by side with the photograph, by golly, it looks like this image actually was based on the photograph. If this is all that you have, it's great to have that. If the both are available, more power to you. Another very important trade for 19th century buildings are bird's eye views. These were aerial views of American cities that started in the 1860s and went up to around the turn of the century. And here you see the Earl Harrison House on its original site between 4th and 5th Street. It's facing 4th Street. And these views, this one was done in 1886, are quite remarkable because they can tell you something about the landscaping of the house, the neighborhood, how close neighboring houses were. It's quite interesting here to see that the Earl Harrison House was set in the middle of the block, really just halfway between 4th Street and 5th Street. So it required several lots to build on. This is also a very important piece of evidence about the house because it's the only image that gives us a sense of the original kitchen. If you look at the upper left part of the house, by golly, that's a representation of the one-story outbuildings. And unfortunately, those were long gone by the time that it was moved in 1968. And so they had to be recreated in a somewhat speculative manner. It's also interesting to see on this that the circular driveway on the house is matched by a slightly smaller circular driveway, and that is the Earl Napier Kennard house. The little one-story part of the house that's at the back was started by the Earl's son, and then the house was completed by the Napier family. So that is still in its original location and is part of the historic Waco Foundation. Here is another very important tool, Sanborn fire insurance maps. These were done in the later 19th century and continued up until the 1950s. And the point of these maps was to assess the flammability of structures. This was basically to serve the insurance industry by telling them whether a building was built of a wood frame, brick, stone, concrete, what have you. And so on the image that we see here, almost everything on this block is made of wood. So it's quite flammable. The pinkish colored building at the top is an indication that that was brick in front, but it had a framed front porch and then additional rooms of frame in the back. And the image in the center is of the Earl Harrison house. So you can see that the portico that's on the east and south sides is marked as being 2 stories, and you can tell it's a portico because of the dashed lines. And you see how it's sitting in the middle of the lot and how the family owned, let's see, something like 5 lots on 4th Street and another 3 lots on 5th Street. So really quite a nice sized property and something that they could sell off over time. And I've paired it here with a recent historic photo. This is when the house had fallen upon hard times, and you can see that the portico has now been filled in with additional rooms. It had been converted into an apartment house or boarding house, and so things like kitchens or bathrooms needed to be added to this. You can also see just the snippet of a cast iron fence in the foreground, which is something that we haven't seen in any of the other images of the house. Another application of bird's eye views. This is a detail from the 1873 bird's eye view, and this shows the Fort House, another historic Waco Foundation house. And the Fort House is at the upper right of the bird's eye view detail. But you can see a lot of the other houses in the neighborhood, but also the Methodist Academy, which is the large white building between Webster and Jackson. And again, you compare this with historic photos like this one from the turn of the century, which shows you that it too had a cast iron fence. And also, if you notice on the portico, there's a cast iron railing. This was probably original, but there was some skepticism about that when the house was restored in the 1950s, and so it wasn't restored in that fashion. You can also see, if you compare the bird's eye view to the historic photograph, that originally the north side, the side that's on Webster, did not have the projection of 1 story that you see in the historic photograph. And that's said to have been made by Colonel Fort in 1876 while the family was off at the Philadelphia Centennial. And that was for an enlargement of the dining room. So there's an interplay between things like bird's eye views or Sanborns and historic photos. Another useful bit of evidence, but you have to treat it with caution, are architectural pattern books. You see here a image from a book called Bicknell's Village Builder, which was published around 1872. Unfortunately, they didn't put the copyright date in the book, but it exposed a lot of Americans to Victorian designs in the post-war era. And apparently one couple that studied this book was John Wesley Mann and his wife Samira Mann. And you can see the way in which the center tower and the projecting bay are both are drawn from this book, and even the shape of the doorway with the round arch and the two panels are remarkably close. There are certainly differences, and people didn't feel compelled to copy things precisely. And in this case, the bay that projects forward is on the left side, which is the north side of the house. As a result of that, the front porches actually allow the family to see people approaching from Waco proper, because they're a little bit upriver. Books were a way of disseminating architectural ideas, but you have to be careful about assuming that all books were available to all people. An especially rare sort of architectural evidence, but it's great when you got it, is surviving architectural drawings. And that's what we have for the Madison and Martha Cooper house in Waco, designed by Glenn Allen with Milton W. Scott. And it's quite interesting because Glenn Allen signed it as a solo, but it's known that he and Milton Scott were working together and were soon to be working on the First Baptist Church and the Dr. Pepper plant. But these are such wonderful documents telling you the original intent of the architect, telling you the materials that were used, even the names of the rooms, which is something that we can't always assume that rooms were referred to exactly the way that we would today. So you're very lucky if you have architectural drawings that survive, or their modern equivalent blueprints, which really start up in the early 20th century. And if you're really lucky, your architectural drawings will have interior details as well as the exterior, which is the case at the Cooper house. And a final hint, read as much as you can about the architectural history of your city, your state, your nation. A good start for those interested in Waco architecture is my recent book, Historic Homes of Waco, Texas, published by Texas A&M University Press in 2019. It's available at the Mayborn Museum store and at bookstores and online. At Home in Waco was a special exhibit shown at the Mayborn Museum Complex in 2019 and 2020 and was made possible by a generous grant from the Summerlee Foundation of Dallas. Thanks for listening. Hope to talk to you sometime soon.